Hi again and welcome to the next video of the 7th section, Terrain Construction. In the previous video we've learned the basics of our game. In this video we'll learn how to create a terrain construction. Now let's start sculpting the terrain. With the terrain object selected, click the leftmost palette icon from the Object Inspector for the Raise Lower Terrain tool, available from the Terrain component. This lets you select brush shapes to paint terrain details. Select a soft round brush and use a large brush size using the brush size slider along with the opacity setting to set the brush strength. Click and drag over the terrain to paint landscape details. Create some hills and mountains for the landscape. Remember, you can hold down the Shift key while clicking to reverse or lower the terrain painting if needed. If the terrain appears too rough to be natural, you can easily smooth out details by switching to the Smooth Height tool. To do this, click on the third button in the Terrain component. When you select this tool, you can choose the brush shape, brush size and opacity as before, but clicking over the terrain will smooth out variations in terrain height. Now that the terrain is sculpted, shaped and smooth as needed, we're ready to start painting it. As it stands, the terrain is grey, dull and underdefined. It has no clear texture or look, such as grass or rock. We'll fix this using the Paint Texture tool. To access this, click on the Paint Texture button, fourth button in the Terrain component from the Object Inspector. When you do this for the first time, you'll need to load in and prepare a set of textures for the painting. Click on the Edit Textures button and then select Add Texture from the context menu that appears. Afterward, a texture configuration dialog appears, allowing you to add new textures to a palette. With the texture selection dialog open and ready to load our first texture, use the Project panel to find the native terrain textures included with the Unity Environment Asset package. These can be found in the Standard Assets, Environment, Terrain Assets, Surface Textures folder. For this example, I'll select a grassy texture. This texture will be used as a base texture to flood fill the terrain. Click and drag the grass texture from the project panel to the albedo slot of the texture selection dialog. The normal channel can be left empty. After adding the first texture to the texture selection dialog, be sure to set the texture size. This refers to the size in meters that a single tile of the texture should cover. Smaller values decrease texture tiling but make each tile seem larger. Larger values increase texture tiling but each tile seems smaller. Getting the tiling values correct is a process of trial and error, tweaking values until it looks correct on the terrain. For this example, I've used the value 75 by 75. Then click on the Add button. After clicking on the Add button, the base texture will be tiled across the terrain. From a distance, the tiling may look obvious and unpleasant in the scene viewport. You may be tempted on the basis of this to adjust the tiling settings. However, from a first-person perspective, the terrain will look very different. For this reason, use a first-person controller prefab from the native assets to preview the terrain in first-person mode, seeing how texture tiling appears at ground level. If you need to edit the existing texture tiling, simply select the texture thumbnail from the Textures palette in the Terrain component of the Object Inspector, and then choose the Edit Textures button. At this stage, the terrain object features a grass texture tiled seamlessly across the surface, which is the base texture. While this looks acceptable, it'd be great to include a greater texture variety in the terrain, including some grassy, rocky and maybe even a desert-style terrain. This is achieved by adding more textures via the Terrain Selection dialog. Just click on the Edit Textures button and then choose Add Texture from the context menu. Then drag and drop a new and different texture to the albedo slot of the Texture Selection dialog. And finally, repeat this process to add as many textures as needed. On closing the dialog, all added textures will appear in the Textures palette from the Object Inspector. The active texture assigned to the painter brush is highlighted with a blue border in the inspector. You can click on a texture thumbnail to select a different texture. When you do this, the selected texture is assigned to the painter brush and can be applied to the terrain just by clicking on it. Clicking and dragging on the terrain will paint the texture to the terrain. You can also use the brush shape, brush size, opacity, and target strength values to control how strongly the texture is applied and how it's blended into the terrain beneath. Now go ahead and complete terrain painting, creating a look and feel that you like. Once completed, select the Scene Directional Light from the Hierarchy panel and change its rotation to position the sun wherever it looks good. As an aside, notice that you can control a complete day-night cycle in terms of lighting and appearance by rotating a light a complete 360 degrees. Therefore, you can create an easy day and night cycle for games just by animating a directional light using the animation window seen in an earlier section. Finally, take a tour of the terrain using a first-person controller asset. Press the play icon on the toolbar and explore around the level. Before moving forward, let's consider the technical limitations of Unity terrains and the impact this can potentially have for your games. Specifically, the Unity terrain is height map based. This means that the elevations, ups and downs of the terrain are generated internally based on grayscale pixels in an image file, the height map. When painting the terrain using brushes from the inspector, you are, under the hood, painting pixels onto the height map, which is used to deform the terrain. This is a clever and fascinating process, but it comes with an important limitation. Namely, a height map is a 2D topographical texture. The result is that Unity terrains are not truly 3D at a procedural level. They cannot contain caves, crevices, caverns, or any inward cutouts. The player cannot go under anything. Rather, it consists simply of up and down sections, none of which have interior spaces. Now, in many cases, this won't be a problem. However, sometimes you'll need these internal spaces, and then when you do, you'll want to consider alternatives to the native terrain system. Alternatives include asset store plugins, but also natural terrains in 3D modeling software such as 3ds Max, Maya, and Blender. Congratulations! You now have a game world with a terrain included. In the next video, we'll learn navigation and navigation meshes.